Good evening to both our in-person audience and those joining us on YouTube. Welcome to the Friends of the Missouri State Archives Thursday evening speaker series. My name is Vicki Myers and I'm president of the Friends, and we are responsible for these Thursday night programs. Tonight we welcome to the archives D.M. Giangreco, who I'm going to call Dennis. That's what he likes to be called anyway. Dennis served as an editor of military review at the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, for 20 years, and subsequently as the editor and publications director for the Foreign Military Studies Office, also at Fort Leavenworth. He is the award-winning author or co-authors of 14 books on military and socio-political subjects, including Hell to Pay, Operation Downfall and the Invasion of Japan, 1945 to 1947, as well as Eyewitness Pacific Theater, first-hand accounts of the war in the Pacific from Pearl Harbor to the atomic bombs. Dennis's most recent work is Truman and the Bomb, The Untold Story. Volume 2 of his The Soldier from Independence, a military biography of Harry S. Truman, will be released in 2026. So please join me in welcoming Dennis to the Missouri State Archives.
Thank you. It's great to be here. But thinking about it a little, it strikes me that the title "Down the Memory Hole" might not be the right way to describe Harry Truman's hidden role in the Soviet invasion of Manchuria. After all, the raw magnitude of the U.S. assistance to the invasion of Manchuria never really became a part of history in the first place. In the spring of 1945, while the Manhattan Project moved towards its questionable future, other highly secret and ostensibly more tangible secret initiatives continued apace as the countdown on the Pacific ground on. There was Milepost, the mammoth westward surge of U.S. supplies to prepare Soviet forces in the Far East for their coming war with Japan, even as under Project Hula, Russian sailors by the thousands passed in the opposite direction to Cold Bay, Alaska, to be secretly trained to operate nearly 100 made-in-USA warships when the Soviets went to war. Meanwhile, ongoing planning codenamed Keelblocks for the direct U.S. support of Soviet combat operations was further refined by staffs in Washington and the Pacific as the endgame came into sharper focus. Today, Milepost, Hula, and Keelblocks remain off the radar screens of both historians and World War II history wonks, and for good reason. Unlike Lend-Lease in the war against the Nazis, which was given great visibility and trumpeted throughout the war, convoys above the Arctic Circle valiantly fighting their way to Murmansk, trains festooned with Soviet and American flags rumbling across Iran to the Caucasus, and so on. Lend-Lease aid on Milepost's Soviet-flagged Liberty ships to prepare the neutral Russians for the coming war was a closely guarded secret because of the extreme vulnerability of both Russia's land and sea lines of communication to preemptive action by even a severely weakened Japan. Best way to get across the situation that first Tsarist Russia and then the Soviet Union faced in the Far East is to make it clear that the maritime provinces and their principal port, Vladivostok, were far, far more vulnerable to Imperial Japan than even the tenuous U.S. position in the Philippines at the time of Pearl Harbor. The lifeline upon which so much depended for the Russians was the Trans-Siberian Railroad, and General John R. Dean, chief of the U.S. military mission in Moscow, did not mince words when describing the situation, its limitations inflicted on the Soviets. Quote, "The Trans-Siberian Railroad constitutes the bottleneck in the support of military operations in Siberia. It is now double-tracked for for most of its 10,000 miles, but there are still enough stretches of single track to reduce its capacity considerably. On the eastern end, the roadbed is within a few miles of the northern and eastern borders of Manchuria, and it was therefore quite vulnerable to Japanese land and air attack. It has numerous bridges and tunnels, the destruction of which would have indefinitely interrupted traffic between Western Russia and the maritime provinces. The only other source of supply was from across the Pacific, meaning us, and it was reasonable to suppose that Japan would be able to blockade that route as well." Even on a map of this scale, you can see how close it runs to Japanese territory. Now it forms the northern border of Manchuria for more than 1,200 miles, essentially the same distance as New Orleans to Minneapolis. Along most of this, the tracks run a bare 30 to 35 miles from the river and as little as 10 to 15 along numerous stretches. Turning south, the railroad runs a further 250 miles towards the Vladivostok area, all while under easy observation and reach of the Imperial Japanese Army on the West Bank. Now, the Soviets were painfully aware of all this, and despite great efforts, the line's capacity in relation to the maritime provinces' increased needs had changed only marginally in the decades since the Russo-Japanese War 40 years earlier, when it was blamed as a principal reason for the Russian defeat. Throughout the long U.S. effort to bring the Soviet Union into the war against Japan, followed by the detailed coordination with them to ensure that they had exactly what they needed for a full-blood offensive rather than one that was limited in nature. The Soviets repeatedly stressed the need for absolute secrecy, lest the Japanese preempt everything by simply striking along the exposed rail line. At one point during the October 1944 meetings in Moscow, when Stalin and his Army Chief of Staff, General Alexei Antonov, when rumors of negotiations appeared in American newspapers, Stalin forcefully expressed his concern to Ambassador Averell Harriman. General Dean, by the way, used the word berated. And Harriman sent a somewhat diplomatically sanitized account to FDR. Quote, "The need for utmost secrecy must be observed." Stalin stated that he wished to explain why he was so insistent on security and caution. If there was any indiscretion, he feared that information might leak out to the press, which would cause the Japanese to embark on premature adventures, as a result of which the valuable Vladivostok area might be lost. Stalin said that if Vladivostok were lost before major operations commenced, it would be extremely unfortunate for both our countries. Perhaps to soften the pummeling, Stalin added, "I am a cautious old man." Almost a year before at Tehran, Stalin had promised his Western allies, or rather had surprised his Western allies by opening the conference with a statement that the Soviet Union would join them in their war against Japan after Germany's capitulation. Now, during the October 44 Moscow negotiations, he reiterated that his Tehran pledge was not empty words and remarked that the US and Soviet strategic plans were in coordination. The United States would strike the industrial heart of Japan, while the Soviet Union would, quote, break Japan's spine. Imperial forces in Manchuria, Korea, and northern China, according to contemporary estimates, then totaled 1,200,000 men, and the U.S. Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall contended that if the United States invaded Japan before a Soviet declaration of war, a considerable part of Japan's 800,000-man army group in Manchuria would be transferred to the home islands and concentrated against the Americans. For obvious reasons, General Marshall was anxious to have the Soviets tie down that army group before the invasion of Japan was launched, and was greatly relieved when informed that Stalin agreed that, quoting Harriman, as soon as the Russians struck in the Manchurian Mongolian regions, the Japanese would attempt to move troops back to Korea and Japan, and that Stalin was determined that this retreat must be cut off. In a conference held the previous day, Stalin maintained that if stores could be built up now, the attack could be made 2 to 3 months after Germany's collapse, and stated that planning should begin at once. Throughout the Yalta and Potsdam conferences, as well as all the Moscow negotiations before and between them, the Soviets never deviated from this timetable, which would serve as the basis for all secret military-to-military coordination between the two powers, and an immediate and secret jump in military deliveries to the still neutral Soviet Union, even before it was codified months later at the Yalta Conference, and only subsequently incorporated into the Lend-Lease program. Now, Stalin was not advocating a spoiling attack to force the Japanese off balance, but a knockout blow, which would thus require a vastly larger level of U.S. support to launch a crushing multi-front offensive of this type so quickly after their forces defeated the Nazis in Europe. The Red Army would have to depend on the Americans to secretly supply much, and on some combat fronts, most of the food, fuel, war supplies, and even the trucks to move them both before and during the offensive. At the October 17, 1944 meeting, Ambassador Harriman and General Dean were presented with a breathtakingly huge wish list, and the United States moved immediately in 1944 to prepare the neutral Soviet Union for the coming war through the initiation of the secret Milepost aid program, which was approved by President Roosevelt, then organized and administered not through congressionally established European-focused Lend-Lease channels, but secretly by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. This continued long past the Yalta Conference before it was formalized in April 1945 as part of the Lend-Lease system supporting the Soviet Union in its war with Nazi Germany as Annex 3 of its fourth protocol. Ultimately formalizing the secret supply effort as part of the congressionally approved Lend-Lease program was judged a necessity, or rather a necessary expedient to mask the movement of war materials from both the U.S. Congress and the Japanese. Roosevelt did not trust the State Department. He was his own State Department, but that's a whole different story. Unfortunately, this also resulted in the insertion of the civilian bureaucrats administering the approved Lend-Lease allotments into decision-making roles over the shipping of secret war supplies against Japan. That they were not and could not be let in on the Moscow and Yalta agreements bringing the still neutral Soviets into the Pacific War, led to much confusion as upon the collapse of the Nazi regime, senior officials were thrust into working at cross purposes that even sparked an international incident. The uproar erupted when all aid to the Soviet Union was briefly shut off after the fighting suddenly ended in Europe, where, unlike in East Asia, the Soviet Union was a belligerent and legally entitled to lend-lease aid only through to the German surrender. Though embarrassing to Truman, who at Potsdam was regularly chided by Stalin about the shutoff, the incident had no actual effect on the Soviet buildup ahead of the declaration of war against Imperial Japan. Geared towards offensive operations against Japan, Milepost's mission, both before and after it was deemed a part of Lend-Lease, was to provide the supplies to fully sustain a theater offensive of 1,500,000 men, 3,000 tanks, 75,000 motor vehicles, and 5,000 aircraft during 3 months of intensive combat. The Soviet list was impressive to say the least, and included 23,000 tons of aviation gasoline and vehicle fuel. Next, 186,000 tons of food and fodder, including 60,000 tons of flour, 20,000 tons of beans or macaroni, 25,000 tons of canned meat, and 50,000 tons of oats or barley. Next, 296,000 tons of automobiles, road machines, and aerodrome equipment, including 30,000 trucks, plus 1,000 duck amphibious trucks, 2,000 oil and gas tanker trucks, and two complete truck assembly plants. Next, 306,000 tons of railroad equipment, including 500 locomotives, 300 boxcars, 3,000 boxcars, 2,000 flat cars, 1,000 tank cars, plus 800 kilometers of rails and 500 switches. Next, 14,600 tons of clothing material and hospital supplies, including 4.5 million meters of uniform cloth, 12 million meters of underwear cloth, 2 million pair of shoes, and 3 million meters of overcoat cloth, because it was believed by both the U.S. and the Soviets that the fighting would extend into the Russian winter of 1945-46. And finally, a flotilla of small ships and craft, with major items being 10 frigates, 20 corvettes, 30 minesweepers, 50 large sub-chasers, and 20 large troop landing craft. This, by the way, would later grow from this considerably to become a separate project from Milepost. Codenamed Hula, it included the establishment of a secret base at Cold Bay, Alaska, for the training of more than 12,000 Soviet seamen in the intricacies of U.S. warships and weaponry. Soviet participation in the war was now linked, as Stalin noted, to the Western Allies' vision of the endgame's attrition phase. By this point, material destined for the final battles with the Nazis and to support the general war effort was already allotted and in the pipeline, and the Soviet General Staff placed the total additional tonnage for the coming clash with Japan at 1,056,000 tons, which would require a sea lift of 96 merchant freighters and 14 tankers. And this was only the U.S. down payment on the Soviet offensive. Milepost shipments across the Pacific, much of it on U.S. Liberty ships sailing through Japanese straits, flying the hammer and sickle of the still neutral Soviet Union reached their peak in May and June 1945 before the Potsdam Conference. As the Cold War developed after World War II, both the Soviets and the U.S., each for their own reasons, breathed not a word on Projects Milepost and Hula, nor the Americans' Keelblocks war plans directly supporting Soviet combat operations, which were given the go-ahead halfway through the Potsdam Conference by General Marshall and Admiral King. As early as the spring of 1943, the combined chiefs of staff reported to Truman and the British Prime Minister that, quote, our present strategic concept does not contemplate further amphibious operations west of the Aleutians. Our forces there will assume a defensive role until conditions are favorable to operations in support of Russia. As the Pacific War progressed, Keelblocks contingency planning was conducted in the event that the Soviet Union was attacked by Japan and entered the war. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Ocean Areas, had been kept abreast of developments at the Yalta Conference, and though neither he nor Admiral King believed the U.S. had to actually seize islands in the corrals to keep the milepost supplies flowing, Nimitz wanted to know if they might now have to modify our present concept for a corrals operation. Admiral King replied in February 20, 1945, that in view of the Russian requirement that supplies continue to flow, this is being examined here in Washington, and your planners should examine it likewise. King was confident that Project Hula would decisively tilt control of the Okhotsk Sea in the Soviets' favor. A month later, he instructed Nimitz to also explore the question of establishing a line of communications to Japan through the Tsushima Strait. Located far to the south off Korea, it, unlike La Perouse, which begins to freeze over in October, remains ice-free year-round. But while keeping the supplies flowing through the Okhotsk Sea could be economically accomplished by a modest force without Russian assistance, as long as no amphibious operations were involved, clearing the constricted Tsushima Strait was another matter entirely. Tsushima Island lies squarely in the middle of the passage, which is formally named Korea Strait north of the island and Tsushima Strait on the south. Easily mined, it was lined with shore batteries and ringed with airfields. Nimitz warned that even though Japan's fleet has been greatly reduced and Air Force has suffered severe losses, that there were extreme dangers in conducting operations there, but promised to further evaluate the possibilities once his reconnaissance capabilities on soon-to-be invaded Okinawa were effective, and stated that such an operation would contribute directly to the preparation of Russia to assist. On April 5, 1945, Nimitz reported to King that Admiral William F. Halsey, Commander 3rd Fleet, is now engaged in planning operations to establish a line of communications into Sea of Japan via either La Perouse or Tsushima Strait. And subsequent communications from King re-emphasized that any plans needed to focus on, quote, maintaining a convoy route without securing additional positions through amphibious assaults. On May 21, Nimitz informed King that Keelblock Plans 3 and 4 were nearing completions, with Option 4 calling for Admiral Fletcher's North Pacific Force being augmented by 3 fleet and 7 escort carriers, as well as more than 24 destroyers, plus a heavy bomber group and reconnaissance elements for use against Hokkaido and the southern Kurils, as necessary to support Russian operations in Sakhalin and cover convoy movements. During the Potsdam Conference of during the conference's July 24 tripartite military meeting, and as he had done at the Yalta Conference, and despite Project Hula, Soviet Chief of Staff Anatov asked if the United States would operate against the Kurils in order to open a line of communications to Siberia once hostilities commenced with Japan. But cognizant of the U.S. chief's earlier refusal at Yalta to commit themselves to launching amphibious operations there, Anatov this time added that the Soviets had some strength in Kamchatka and would like to assist with some forces. Nevertheless, the U.S. did not have the resources to engage in such an operation without weakening its efforts far to the south, and Admiral King reiterated that it would not be possible to operate amphibiously against the Kurils. King did, however, have Keelblocks in his back pocket, and likely, much to the relief of the Soviet chiefs, added what they'd long wanted to hear, quote, "He saw no reason why a line of communication could not be maintained through the Kurils." Now, throughout the Potsdam Conference, the Joint Chiefs ensured that Admiral Nimitz and the Army and Strategic Air Forces commanders in the Pacific, Generals Douglas MacArthur and Carl A. Spaatz, were kept fully informed, and all decisions that Admiral King and General Marshall reached with their Soviet counterparts. After the July 24 tripartite military meeting early in the morning on the other side of the globe from Potsdam, the green light was now given to prepare for operations that would burst open the door that the Japanese would hurriedly slam shut when the Soviet Union declared war. Nimitz, in accordance with earlier Keelblocks plans, ordered that Cruiser Division 5's 3 cruisers immediately ready themselves for assignment to Admiral Fletcher's North Pacific Force. In a separate message to Vice Admiral John H. Towers, Commander Air Force's Pacific Fleet, Nimitz also called for 6 escort carriers with 2 flag officers to concentrate in the Marshall Islands in the near future for use in Keelblocks 4, and instructed Towers to warn certain commands to be continually prepared on short notice to supply support elements to the carriers. With the Soviet Union still a neutral nation hampered by highly vulnerable rail and sea supply lines, Nimitz added utmost secrecy directed. In addition to Cruiser Division 5, there were destroyers and long-range reconnaissance aircraft ordered north to bolster Fletcher's Task Force 92, which would soon begin clearing the Kurils of Japanese shipping. Also, in preparation for Soviet entry into the war, the 6 baby flat tops of Carrier Divisions 23 and 26, with yet more cruisers and destroyers, were ordered by Towers to form another task force, Task Force 49, under Rear Admiral Harold G. Martin. From there, they would also be sent north and folded into Fletcher's burgeoning command. These actions were initiated on the morning of July 20, after the July 24 meeting of the U.S. and Soviet chiefs of staff, who held their second and final meeting 2 days later. The following agreements were to become effective upon Soviet entry into the war, and with subsequent clarifications included the establishment of 2 U.S. weather stations at key locations on Soviet territory, and an increase in the number of Russian stations feeding them weather data. Next, that U.S. and Soviet surface forces will operate without restrictions on their own sides of demarcation lines running from the Sea of Japan through the Bering Sea. Next, that boundary lines may be subject to change and that these changes would be affected locally, meaning U.S. and Soviet liaison, without reference to Washington or Moscow. Next, that coordination of U.S. aircraft needing to attack targets or make reconnaissance flights north, or the Soviets to its south of the agreed boundary line running through Mongolia and out to sea, would be affected by local liaison without reference to Washington or Moscow. Next, the Soviet command agreed to the establishment of liaison groups between the American and Soviet commanders, much as had been arranged in Europe with the British. Soviet chiefs of staff liaison groups would operate with MacArthur and Nimitz's headquarters, in addition to a Soviet military mission in Washington. Plus, the American liaison groups will be located with the Soviet High Commander in the Far East and with the commander of Soviet Pacific Fleet in Vladivostok. Furthermore, the Soviet commander was ready to accept the radio teletype equipment for installation at the Soviet headquarters, and that liaison would be affected by these commanders without reference to Washington or Moscow. Next, after D-Day, the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria, Russian and American air and naval craft in emergencies will have access to the nearest facility where they may obtain repairs, servicing, medical care, and otherwise be assisted in making a speedy return to combat. Now, this whole thing about not having to check with and get approval from Moscow was a very, very big deal. The American staff and General Dean in particular were, quote, quite surprised that the Russians were readily agreeing to coordinate so many issues at the local or theater level without reference to Washington or Moscow, and even offered their own suggestions along those lines. With these matters out of the way, Soviet Chief of Staff Anatov broached a very important matter. Quote, the Straits of Tsushima could be used throughout the year, whereas the route through the Kurils and Peru's Strait were closed during part of the year by ice. He asked General Marshall when the invasion of Kyushu would take place and when opening the sea routes from the south could be expected. Now, despite the ships and men cycling through Project Hula and the U.S. fleet preparing to punch a big hole in the Japanese barrier stretching along the Kurils, plus assist in reopening the La Perouse to the west, the Soviets were understandably nervous about a cutoff of shipping due to ice. They had, by Potsdam, received shipments totaling more than 1 million tons of supplies to support the coming war with Imperial Japan. Yet the size and the scope of their coming multi-front offensive could well exhaust much of this reserve in a scant 2 months. So it was imperative that the shipments continue unabated. Speaking for the other U.S. chiefs sitting at his side, Marshall explained to his new Pacific allies that, quote, he appreciated the urgent necessity to the Russian chiefs of staff of opening the southern route and said that we would do all in our power to clear the straits as early as possible. It would be necessary, of course, for our minesweepers to have adequate air cover during their operations in clearing the straits of mines. The time required to establish the necessary airfields for that would depend to a large degree on Japanese resistance on Kyushu, and that the straits might not be opened until the middle of December, or about 6 weeks after the first landing on Kyushu. he pointed out that we would make every effort to expedite that operation for the benefit of our forces as well as for the benefit to the Russians. General Marshall wanted to make this point clear since he desired to avoid any misunderstanding as to our capabilities in clearing Tsushima for traffic to Vladivostok. Convoys through the southern straits with supplies for the Red Armies slugging it out in Manchuria would be protected by the U.S. Pacific Fleet and Army's 5th Air Force, but there would inevitably be heavy casualties involved in this. Hidden kamikazes flying from fields and roadways away from established airfields would never be completely suppressed, and ships transiting channels constricted by unswept mines and freshly laid mines and extensive shore batteries on the long Korean and Japanese coasts would be inviting targets. The United States, however, was now fully committed at Potsdam to supporting Soviet combat operations and would do whatever was in its power, as General Marshall stated, for the benefit of our forces as well as for the benefit to the Russians. Upon the Soviet Union's declaration of war on August 8, 1945, orders were issued for U.S. forces to establish and maintain a line of communications from the Aleutians to the Sea of Okhotsk, neutralize Japanese bases threatening this line of communications, and provide protection to convoys against hostile air, surface, and submarine attacks between the Aleutians, and escort them to turnaround points in the Sea of Okhotsk where the Hula-trained Soviet sailors would take over. As for the potentially far more costly operation in the Tsushima Korea Straits, when the northern waters froze over, in the end, that military commitment made at the Potsdam Conference did not have to be carried out. The southern capitulation of Japanese forces from the Dutch East Indies to China and Manchuria and the home islands meant there would be no invasion of Japan and no young American sailors and airmen putting their lives on the line to force supply convoys through the dangerous waters between Korea and Japan to support the Soviet offensive. Now, I was asked at the recent Schaefer conference in D.C., why haven't we heard of Milepost, of Keelblocks before? Well, immediately after the war, the secrecy surrounding America's role in the Manchurian operation retained its own momentum, and the Soviets themselves made absolutely zero mention of this critical American support, as they wanted nothing to distract from the image of a magnificent achievement of Soviet arms, which it was. Yet, within a relatively short period of time, knowledge of the massive U.S. effort would have grown on its own simply through the wide public interest in all things related to the war if it had not been studiously avoided by both governments. Moscow Mission Chief Dean's book, The Strange Alliance, cleared in 1946 and published the following year, obliquely referenced this when he commented that, quote, "The magnitude of our aid to Russia was rarely mentioned for many reasons, the requirements of secrecy being the one usually given." Meanwhile, increasing tensions with the Soviets were already giving more and more credence to the criticism of Yalta and Potsdam agreements. What little was actually known of them at the time, and had begun in earnest as soon as the shooting stopped. Even before the communist victory in China, and international tensions had developed into a full-blown Cold War, and long before the hot war of Korea with Manchuria now a communist base area immune from retaliation. U.S. direct assistance to the seizure of Manchuria by Red armies was not something that anyone in either the U.S. or Soviet governments, again, each for their own reasons, wanted to draw any attention to. Other than an obscure State Department documents compendium, also published in 1947, down the memory hole it all went, skewing what historians thought they knew about Truman's actions in the final months of the war. Interestingly, in 1955, the Defense Department produced, seemingly out of the blue for public release, an extremely carefully crafted 107-page white paper on U.S. military plans relating to the Soviets joining the war against Japan. That year also saw the release of Foreign Relations of the United States edition, Conversations at Malta and Yalta, covering agreements with the Soviets on their entering the war, as well as the Moscow Conference, which was the genesis of Milepost. Plus, that year saw the publication of Japanese operational planning against USSR from the multi-volume Japanese Special Study on Manchuria series produced by General Headquarters, U.S. Far East Command in Tokyo. So why 1955 for all of this? Okay, well, Senator Joseph McCarthy had already been savaging George C. Marshall for years as supposedly being responsible for the fall of China to the communists. And McCarthy's hearings on subversives in the U.S. Army had only recently concluded. So the timing seems to suggest that perhaps these various long-term projects might have been released at this time in order to get out ahead of even more mischief by McCarthy if he survived his recent Senate censure, which he didn't. I hope I put enough qualifiers into that sentence, by the way. Anyway, or at least that these documents could now be released, assuming that they were even noticed at all, without generating a considerable amount of acrimonious controversy. In any event, more would be piecemealed out over the next decade through State Department, Army, and Navy historical branches. Other material hinting at the scale of U.S.-Soviet cooperation against Japan lay buried throughout the mass of Army and Navy documents later declassified in the mid-70s, while some became available in the relevant presidential libraries and briefly after glasnost from the Soviet Federation itself. All of them having no effect whatsoever, as the narratives on the war had long been established. This material created and released over many years by compartmentalized civil and military organizations reporting up their own chains of command. They individually bear few obvious clues to the depth of U.S. and Soviet cooperation in the final 10 months of the war. Documents, they're produced individually from all this wide range of different civil and military organizations. Really, because they are so apparently so disconnected, they don't ever refer to each other. There's really no obvious connections for historians to notice this stuff unless they have kind of approached it from the bottom end and started working their way up. Today, the dropping of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, followed by the immediate surrender of Japan, continues to overshadow the Soviet declaration of war and invasion of Manchuria. Nevertheless, The use of nuclear weapons against Imperial Japan in no way negates the fact that the United States fully accepted the political gains in the Far East that Stalin locked in at Yalta and Potsdam. As noted earlier, after the war, the results of those two conferences increasingly became a matter of grave concern for many Americans, and really no effort was made by either the U.S. Armed Forces or the State Department to publicize the extent of direct U.S. aid in support of Soviet military operations against their old Japanese enemy. And one fundamentally important point struck me only recently, well after my hell to pay on U.S. planning for the invasion of Japan and Japanese planning for the defense of Japan was published, and is addressed directly in my current book, Truman and the Bomb. It is the fact that the United States keeping mum on its direct support, some might say bankrolling, of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria is in what itself what opened the door to all the deep misconceptions that were later spread regarding Truman and the endgame in the Pacific. Though this level of U.S. involvement and support of the Soviet invasion of Manchuria was a political hot potato that undoubtedly would have caused enormous grief to the Truman administration, the Democratic Party, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and to George C. Marshall in particular, that this was invisible and kept invisible by both governments created a massive void in the historiography of the war, which prevented a fuller understanding of what President Truman's atom bomb decision was and wasn't, and the end game in the Pacific, a void ready to be filled by all kinds of nonsense. Now, all of this, the Milepost and Hula special projects plus Keelblocks planning being given the green light from the Potsdam Conference, flies in the face of the popular notion of a so-called race by Truman to drop atomic bombs on Japan before Stalin could enter the Pacific War. Yet in reality, there actually was a race of sorts going on at the close of the Pacific War, but it was a race by both the Americans and the Russians, not against each other, but by both to get the Red Army into the war against Imperial Japan as quickly as possible.